Why had the captain stopped so suddenly in the doorway? The armory smelled of gun oil and cold steel, a place where silence lived in the cracks of the concrete walls. And there she was, a young woman hunched over a rifle that looked as though it had been built for giants. Cross didn't notice him at first, or maybe she did, and simply chose not to show it. Her hands moved with calm precision, a cloth tracing the barrel's grooves like she was polishing a secret no one else deserved to know. Holt wasn't a man easily unsettled. At 38, with scars stitched across his memory from 3 long deployments, he had learned that nothing inside a forward operating base should surprise him. Yet something had. The open folder on the desk in front of him, a folder he shouldn't have touched but whose scattered pages seemed almost to invite his eyes, and stamped there in thick red ink, as undeniable as blood on snow. Confirmed engagement, 3,150 meters, Kandahar Ridge. His throat tightened. He had read about legendary shots, feats so improbable they were whispered among soldiers like folklore. But this wasn't myth on a forum or speculation in a briefing room. This was a record in a personnel file, an official mark beside the name of a 24-year-old woman who sat only 15 feet away, running a cleaning rod through the barrel of a M200 as if nothing in the world were extraordinary. He stared at her for a long moment. 5'6", lean and wiry like someone who carried endurance in her bones. Auburn hair tied back with regulation discipline. A face both young and older than it should be, the kind that had seen things people only dreamed of in nightmares. If the file was true, then she had accomplished something that stretched the limits of human calculation. If the file was true, then this woman had silenced a target from nearly 2 miles away, and in the mountains of Afghanistan no less. But how? Sergeant Cross, Holt said finally, letting his voice break the air between them. She didn't look up, only paused for the briefest second before continuing the rhythmic cleaning of her rifle. Yes, sir. He studied her hands, steady and deliberate, working with the kind of familiarity that spoke of thousands of repetitions. He wanted to ask about the file. He wanted to ask if it was even possible, but instead he said, "There's a briefing tomorrow, 600 hours. Special reconnaissance, high-value target." This time she did look up. Her eyes, green, sharp, unflinching, met his with a stillness that unsettled him more than the red stamp had. He felt, absurdly, as though she were the one evaluating him, measuring his weaknesses, his hesitations. "Distance to target?" she asked flatly. "Approximately 2,000 meters, mountain terrain, limited concealment." She nodded once, no expression, no question, just acknowledgement, and then she returned to her rifle as if the conversation had ended. Holt remained standing there, unwilling to leave. Something about her silence made him restless. He had served alongside dozens of snipers, men and women whose job was to bend distance and precision into lethal certainty. But none of them had carried the kind of reputation hinted at in those 3 red words. He wanted to know what it meant. He wanted to know who she was when no one was watching. "How long have you been shooting?" he asked, unable to resist. "Since I was 12, she said, her voice clipped, efficient. "My father taught me on hunting rifles in Montana, targets at 100 meters, worked my way up, military training after that, scout sniper school, advanced marksmanship, specialized long range with the British SAS." She paused just long enough to slide the bolt carrier group free from the rifle's body. The came later. Montana. He imagined the open plains, the endless sky, the patience required to line up a deer through a scope. Then he thought of Kandahar Ridge. 37 coalition soldiers lost to 1 bomb maker, and a single sniper who waited 18 hours for the chance to put an end to it. "Montana to 3,000 meters, he murmured. "That's quite a progression." For the first time, something almost like a smile touched her lips, not warmth, not even amusement, more like the faint memory of one. "My father said shooting was 10% equipment, 90% patience. He was wrong about the percentages, but he understood the principle." "And what's that?" That every shot begins in your mind, not your rifle. She lifted a small component, holding it under the light, examining it for imperfections invisible to anyone else. The bullet doesn't care about your emotions or your doubts. It follows physics, wind speed, pressure, humidity, the rotation of the earth. All of it can be calculated. But the human element, the ability to execute without deviation, that's what determines success. Her words landed heavy. Holt leaned closer without realizing it, pulled into the gravity of her calm. And at 3,000 meters, he pressed. This time her hand stopped. She set the piece down carefully and looked straight at him. For a heartbeat, he saw something flicker behind her eyes, not calculation, not discipline. Pain, maybe even regret. At 3,000, she whispered, you're not just fighting physics, you're fighting time itself. The bullet takes over 4 seconds to reach. You're not shooting where they are, you're shooting where they will be. And in 4 seconds, she exhaled. Everything can change. Silence filled the armory again. Not the ordinary silence of metal and concrete, but a living weight that pressed against them both. Holt finally understood. The file wasn't just numbers. It wasn't just record-breaking distance. It was proof that this woman had lived in those 4 seconds. Waited, calculated, pulled a trigger, knowing her choice would ripple forward through time in ways she couldn't undo. He wanted to ask if the shot had been clean. But when he did, she didn't even look up from reassembling the bolt carrier. There are no clean shots at that distance, sir. Only necessary ones. Her jaw tightened as she clicked the pieces back together. Necessary. That was all. The moral equation compressed into 2 words. Holt felt the truth of it sink into him like lead. Tell me something, he said quietly. How do you live with that, with knowing? Paused again. This time the smallest tremor passed through her hands, quickly controlled, quickly hidden. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of gravity he had heard only from soldiers who had buried too many ghosts. You remember why you're here. The man on Kandahar Ridge wasn't just a fighter, he was a bomb maker. He killed 37 people, including medics. If I hadn't taken that shot, more would have died. That's the calculus. It isn't pleasant, it isn't easy, but it's necessary. Her tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't even resigned. It was something else, a kind of hard truth carved out of long hours alone with a scope, staring at targets that were also human beings. Holt leaned back, his chest tight. He thought of all the soldiers he'd seen break under less. Men who had carried guilt for shots taken at 50 meters, or for lives ended in a room where chaos left no time for choice. And yet here she was, a young woman who had done the impossible and still found a way to bear it. Not lightly, not cleanly, but with a kind of disciplined honesty. He realized something then. She wasn't just lethal. She wasn't just skilled. She was holding herself together by refusing to lie about what it cost. Do you ever regret it? He asked. She met his gaze again, her voice steady. I regret that it was necessary, that 37 had to die before one did, that diplomacy failed, that the world is the kind of place where my skill matters. But do I regret pulling the trigger? No, I don't. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the space between them. For a long moment, Holt had no words. She had stripped the act of all romance, all myth, and left only its core, responsibility. He wasn't sure whether to feel admiration or sorrow, perhaps both. When she shouldered the to reassemble its weight, he finally saw her as she truly was. Not just the girl in the corner, not just the sniper in the file, but a soldier who bore isolation like armor, someone who would carry the weight so others wouldn't have to. And yet beneath all of that, Holt sensed the smallest crack, a silence too heavy even for her to ignore forever. He would learn later that silence was her way of surviving, but tonight it haunted him. Because the red ink in her file had already begun to bleed into his own thoughts. Why was she already there before dawn, maps spread across the table like a puzzle no one else cared enough to solve? Holt had walked into the briefing room expecting emptiness, expecting the gray quiet that always came before orders hardened into action. Instead, he found her bent over a topographical chart, her finger tracing valleys, and as though she'd been memorizing them all night. Her combat gear looked almost too heavy for her frame, yet she wore it as if it belonged to her, the vest, the sidearm, the headset coiled at her neck. Beside her chair lay the transport case for the broken down into parts but heavier than most men would want to carry. Holt paused at the doorway, unseen for a moment, just watching. She wasn't talking. She wasn't waiting for instructions. She was preparing as though the weight of the operation already sat on her shoulders. He finally cleared his throat. "Good morning, Sergeant." She didn't look up. "Sir." A single word clipped as her eyes remained on the map. Range cards show 3 possible positions, but only one has sight lines with enough concealment. Of course she had already run the math. Holt pulled out a chair across from her and sat, the stiffness in his spine more from unease than posture. "You've been here long." "Since 4:30. And you've already—" "Yes," she finally glanced at him. "Elevation, angles, vegetation density, wind corridors, all calculated." He nodded, not sure whether to feel relieved or concerned. She was young, yet she worked like someone who had no choice but to be perfect. At precisely 600, the door opened. Intelligence officers filed in, followed by operations staff and logistics. The atmosphere was professional, clinical. Yet Holt's eyes never strayed far from her, from the way she sat with absolute stillness, waiting, listening, absorbing every word. The briefing officer tapped a laser pointer against the projected map. "Target is a Taliban commander, coordinating attacks on supply convoys, expected to be at this compound by 18:30 tonight. Civilian population nearby, 30 families. High probability of mosque attendance during the engagement window. Compound is reinforced mud brick with concrete foundation. Limited ballistic protection." His voice cut through the air. "Civilian activity radius." The officer blinked at her interruption but checked his notes. 500 meters. Families are likely at evening prayer. Exposure minimal. She jotted notes in the margin of her map. Holt watched her face, calm but unrelenting. Every answer mattered to her, every number. "Weather," she asked next. "Clear skies. Northeast winds at 5 to 8 miles per hour. Temperature high 38 Celsius. Barometric pressure steady." Another note, another calculation. The others shifted in their chairs, impatient, as though her questions dragged out the inevitable. But Holt recognized something else. She wasn't asking out of curiosity. She was building a picture no one else could see, a living equation of distance, angles, physics, and morality. For her, this wasn't just another briefing. It was the shaping of a moment where there could be no second chances. By the time the officers left, hadn't moved. She continued tracing her finger along the maps, lips pressed thin, eyes scanning as if the ink might rearrange itself into new threats. Holt lingered. "Concerns?" he asked finally. "The timeline." She didn't look up. 4.5 hours to reach position. No margin for complications. Civilian movement could shift. Weather patterns can change. New construction near the compound isn't on the intel report. "You think the data's wrong?" "I think it's incomplete." Her eyes flicked up at him, sharp and certain. "Incomplete data gets civilians killed." Holt leaned back. She wasn't wrong. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Command and control. Updates on civilian movement. If parameters change, I need authority to abort." He frowned. "The decision to authorize force comes from command." "The decision to pull the trigger comes from me," she replied evenly. "And if I miscalculate, if I read the situation wrong, people die who shouldn't. That responsibility isn't yours, it's mine." Her words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a verdict. Holt felt the weight of them settle across the room like lead. She wasn't just accepting accountability, she was demanding it. Hours later, as equipment checks began, Holt found himself watching her again. She handled each piece with obsessive precision. Ammunition weighed to the grain. Optics adjusted by micrometer. Communications gear tested and retested. She carried 20 rounds for the 10 for a backup system. Each cartridge was examined under magnification, the brass glinting under harsh fluorescent light. "How many rounds will you need?" Holt asked. "One. And if you miss?" She didn't look up. "I don't miss." There was no arrogance in her voice, just fact, a truth sharpened by thousands of hours and a perfect record. By midday, her gear was packed and ready. Holt noted how her demeanor shifted. Conversation faded. She moved into a silence that was almost meditative, as if pulling herself inward, away from the distractions of the base, into a place where only math and focus remained. On the helicopter ride out, she barely moved. The landscape beneath them was jagged and unforgiving, ridges like broken teeth cutting through dust and stone. Holt stole glances at her, eyes closed, breathing steady, not asleep. He realized with a strange unease that she was rehearsing, not physically but in her mind, each calculation, each motion, each variable accounted for. He wondered what it was like inside her head, a storm of numbers layered over the stillness of breath. The pilot's voice cut through the headset. 2 minutes to landing zone. Her eyes opened. No nerves, no tremor, just that same stillness. She shouldered her pack, adjusted straps, and in one practiced motion lifted the rifle case. 60 pounds of gear carried like a promise. When the helicopter touched down, she was already moving. No wasted steps, no hesitation. She disappeared into the rocks like she belonged to them. Holt watched until she was gone, a shadow blending into the mountain. Back at the Tactical Operations Center, Holt monitored her progress through radar pings and satellite blips. She moved with deliberate precision, maintaining perfect noise discipline, crossing terrain that would have broken men twice her size. At exactly 1600 hours, her voice came through the radio. "Overwatch 6, this is Phantom 7. Position established. Beginning reconnaissance." Calm, professional, almost too calm. Through the hours that followed, Holt could only imagine what she saw through her scope. The compound, the shifting guards, the wind tugging at banners of dust. She would be calculating constantly, every breath an adjustment, every twitch of air another variable. And then at 18:15 hours the report came. Target arrived. Her voice over comms was steady. "Phantom 7, target acquired, positive identification." The authorization followed, cleared hot. Silence stretched across the channel. Holt closed his eyes. He imagined her lying prone, cheek pressed to stock, breath slowing. The trigger weight beneath her finger. And he thought of the question he hadn't asked, not about physics, not about precision, but about the cost. Because in those seconds, when the world narrowed to a single human figure 2,000 meters away, she wasn't just carrying a rifle. She was carrying the weight of judgment. And Holt knew something then, as his headset crackled with her steady breathing. The bullet hadn't even left the barrel, but the silence that followed would already belong to her. Why did time seem to slow when nothing had yet happened? The compound lay 2 kilometers away, a patch of earth walled in mud brick, its courtyard painted by shadows of evening. Through the scope, Cross could see everything in microscopic detail. The cracks in the wall, the faded pattern on a rug draped across a doorway, the dust rising beneath a man's sandals. And then, the target. He emerged like he owned the courtyard. Tall, mid-40s, dressed in traditional robes, moving with the confidence of someone who had ordered deaths without ever touching blood himself. 2 bodyguards trailed close, their eyes scanning, hands never far from weapons. Didn't blink. Positive identification confirmed. She whispered it across the comms, her voice steady, almost too calm. "Phantom 7, target acquired." "Copy, Phantom 7, cleared hot." And then silence. The rifle lay heavy against her shoulder, bipod legs anchored into rock. Her cheek pressed to the stock, breath slowed to a rhythm practiced 1,000 times. One inhale, one exhale. The world narrowed until there was nothing but crosshairs and a heartbeat. She began the sequence. Wind from the northeast 6 miles per hour steady, elevation drop measured, temperature and pressure accounted for. Distance 2,000 meters. Bullet flight time 2.3 seconds. Lead 4 feet. She adjusted, micro movements almost invisible, each calculation a thread in a web only she could see. In the command center, Holt watched her vital signs scrolling across a monitor. Heart rate steady, no spike. Breathing even. Yet he felt the tension like a wire stretched to breaking. He knew what was coming. He just didn't know how to carry the weight of watching it happen. Through the scope, she studied the man's face. Not as a shape, not as a silhouette, a face. Lines around his mouth. Dark eyes. Lips moving as he spoke to one of the guards. She wondered if his voice was gentle when he spoke to his children. She wondered if he believed what he was doing mattered. And then she stopped wondering because wondering wasn't part of the equation. Her finger tightened, the rifle thundered. The recoil was a living thing, pushing into her shoulder, vibrating through her bones. The M200 barked once, a single report echoing off the mountains like a verdict. The bullet tore free, invisible, a 300-grain promise cutting through 2,000 meters of air. And then came the waiting. 2 seconds. 2 eternal seconds where nothing could change, nothing could be recalled, nothing could be undone. Holt leaned forward in the command center, every muscle rigid, as though his own body could will the bullet's path. At 2.3 seconds it struck. Through her scope saw it clearly. The man jerked, then collapsed, life snuffed out before his body even hit the dust. No drama, no explosion, no cinematic flourish. Just stillness, final and absolute. Overwatch 6, Phantom 7. Target down. Confirmed kill on primary objective. The channel crackled back. Copy Phantom 7, outstanding work, begin extraction. But didn't move, not yet. She kept her eye pressed to the scope, tracking the courtyard, watching the chaos unfurl. Guards shouting, civilians spilling from doorways, confusion rippling outward like rings in water. Her job was done. The shot was perfect, but the perfection didn't ease the weight pressing against her chest. Only when the courtyard emptied did she lower the rifle, slow and deliberate, hands steady but eyes tired. She began disassembling with the same mechanical precision she had shown in maintenance. No rush, no wasted motion, just routine. Routine was safety. Routine was control. Holt exhaled in the command center, not realizing until then that he'd been holding his breath. His heart hammered, but hers had never flinched. The extraction went smooth. She moved through rocky terrain like a shadow, slipping into the pickup zone with minutes to spare. The helicopter arrived on schedule, its rotors chopping the evening air into thunder. Soldiers pulled her aboard, but she hardly spoke. She strapped in, closed her eyes, and sank into silence. The ride back was uneventful. Outside, mountains slid by in twilight. Inside, Holt glanced at her across the cabin. She sat motionless, the rifle case beside her as if guarding it even now. Her face gave nothing away, but her silence said everything. At base, the procedures unfolded like clockwork. Equipment accounted for, ammunition checked, debriefing scheduled. Her report was concise, factual, no embellishment, no emotion. She spoke of angles, atmospherics, timings. She didn't speak of the man's face. She didn't speak of the 2 seconds between thunder and silence. Later, Holt found her in the armory again. Same corner, same rifle on the table, but she wasn't cleaning it. She was staring at it, just staring as though the weight of it had finally caught up. The folder sat beside her, open again, ready for a new line in red ink. Confirmed engagement, 2,000 meters. Operation Desert Strike. He sat down across from her, voice quiet. Hell of a shot. Her eyes lifted, older than yesterday. It was necessary. That doesn't make it easy. No, she agreed softly, it doesn't. The two of them sat in silence. For once, silence wasn't empty. It was shared, a recognition, a burden neither could name out loud. Finally, she reached for her cleaning kit. The familiar ritual began, piece by piece, cloth against steel, oil against friction. Holt realized then what this routine was. Not maintenance, not habit, it was survival, a way to take control of something in a world where control was an illusion. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Every day." She didn't look up. "But someone has to do this, and I'm qualified. As long as there are threats, there will be need. And when there are," she paused, the cloth frozen mid-stroke, "maybe there will never be a time when there are." Her words hung between them. He thought about the way wars ended, only to begin somewhere else. He thought about the silence that always followed the thunder. And he understood what she carried. Not just the rifle, not just the file. Why was she still sitting there an hour later, long after the rifle gleamed and the armory had emptied? Holt found her exactly where he'd left her, the same corner table, the broken down and clean, every surface polished to perfection. Yet she hadn't moved on. The cloth still rested in her hand. Her eyes lingered not on the rifle but on the file beside it, a file that now carried another red line. Confirmed engagement, 2,000 meters, Operation Desert Strike. Holt stood in the doorway, unwilling to break the moment. She hadn't heard him, or maybe she had and chose to ignore him like before. He studied her face in the harsh fluorescent light. It looked older than it should, the kind of face war carved into someone too young to deserve it. "Hell of a shot," he said again, softer this time as though repetition might matter. She didn't look up, only set the cloth down, folding it carefully, square edges meeting. It was necessary. He walked closer, pulling out the chair across from her. "Doesn't make it easier." Her eyes rose finally, green and sharp but carrying a weariness that no amount of rest could cure. "No," she whispered. "It doesn't." The silence stretched, but this time it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence two people shared when they both understood what words couldn't carry. For Holt, it was the silence of years spent watching men fall apart under the burden of decisions no one else would ever know about. For it was the silence of the shooter, the seconds after the thunder, the echo that lived longer than the sound itself. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Do you ever think about walking away?" Her hands resumed motion, slow and steady, folding her kit with mechanical precision. "Every day." "Then why don't you?" She paused, eyes on the rifle case. "Because someone has to do this, and I'm good at it, too good. You don't walk away from something the world still needs." Holt didn't answer. He thought of her father in Montana, teaching her patience with hunting rifles, never knowing he was preparing her for the loneliness of deserts and mountains half a world away. He thought of Kandahar Ridge, of 37 lives ended by one man, and of the bullet that silenced him after 18 hours of waiting. He thought of tonight's shot, 2,000 meters, a kill perfect on paper, yet one that left her staring at steel as though it might answer questions no one else dared ask. Finally she spoke again, quieter now. "I regret that the world is the kind of place where my skills are necessary. I regret that we can't always solve things with words. I regret that good people die while others prosper. But do I regret being able to stop it, even if only for one mission?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I don't regret that." Holt swallowed hard. The way she said it wasn't defiant, it was simply true. Later that week he watched her again in briefings, in hallways at the range. She carried herself with the same stillness, the same precision, but he noticed the distance in her eyes. Not detachment, something sharper, isolation. She moved among others but never with them. Conversations slipped around her like water around stone. Soldiers respected her, some even admired her, but no one drew close. It wasn't arrogance that set her apart. It was the burden of knowing things they didn't, of holding responsibilities no one wanted to imagine, and Holt wondered how long a person could live in that kind of isolation before it hollowed them out. 3 weeks later, new intelligence arrived. Enemy activity surging in the north. A high-value target identified. A man coordinating attacks against humanitarian convoys. Over 80 civilians and soldiers dead because of his orders. The situation was clear. Conventional assault was impossible. Drone strikes were ruled out, too close to a village school, too many lives at risk, which left only one option. When Holt looked up from the maps, she was already there, standing in his doorway with a folder thick with reconnaissance photos and ballistic notes. He hadn't called for her. She hadn't been summoned, but she knew. "I've run preliminary calculations," she said, stepping forward to lay the folder across his desk. "Target compound is here." She tapped the image, then the opposite. "Feasible shooting position is here." "Range?" She hesitated, eyes meeting his for the briefest second. 3,400 meters. The number landed between them, like a challenge to gravity itself. Holt exhaled. "That's beyond Kandahar, beyond anything you've done before." "It's beyond standard ammunition," she corrected, "but not beyond the with modifications. I've been working with the armorer, experimental propellants, aerodynamic projectiles. Initial testing shows sufficient velocity to maintain lethal energy at that distance." He opened the folder. Her notes were meticulous: wind charts, pressure readings, angles, calculations scribbled in tight, neat handwriting. Diagrams of bullet trajectories, estimates of drift, corrections for. It wasn't just planning. It was obsession. "And the margin for error?" he asked quietly. She didn't flinch. "Severe. At 3,400 meters, flight time approaches 5 seconds. Environmental conditions can change in that interval. A 1 mile/hour shift in wind could mean a miss by feet, not inches." "And your probability of success?" Her green eyes stayed on his, unblinking. 60% under ideal conditions, closer to 40 under realistic ones. The honesty cut sharper than the numbers themselves. Most soldiers would exaggerate. Most would cling to bravado, but not her. She dealt in reality, and the reality was this: the mission's chance of failure outweighed its chance of success. Yet there was no other option. "What would improve your odds?" Holt asked. 72 hours of observation for environmental data, high-altitude reports, sustained surveillance for positive identification. She tapped the photo again. "The compound has multiple structures. He moves between them. At that distance, a misidentification is unacceptable." Holt leaned back in his chair, studying her. This wasn't just a marksman. This was a strategist, a scientist, an operator who refused to trade humanity for efficiency. She wasn't chasing records. She was chasing certainty. Still, he heard the unspoken truth in her voice. A 3,400-meter shot wasn't just physics. It was psychology. If she failed, if she missed, if the target lived, the consequences would ripple. Civilians would die. Soldiers would pay the price. She knew it. She carried it already before even setting foot on the ridge. "I'll bring it to planning staff," Holt said finally. She nodded once, gathering her notes, but at the doorway she paused, turning back. "Sir, if it fails, if he escapes, it won't just compromise the mission. It could compromise everything after: retaliation, civilian lives, coalition trust." He heard what she wasn't saying. "Are you willing to let me try when the odds are this low?" He didn't answer, not yet. When she left, the silence in his office seemed heavier than ever. He looked again at the red stamps in her file: 3,150 meters, 2,000 meters, and now possibly 3,400, a number that seemed to stretch past the edge of what a human being should attempt. And yet, if anyone could carry it, it was her. Why was she the one already waiting in his office when Holt arrived before sunrise? The rest of the base still slept, the corridors dim and silent, but Cross sat across from his desk with a folder so thick it looked as if it had swallowed weeks of work. She didn't look tired. She didn't look impatient. She simply looked ready. "Preliminary ballistics reports," she said, sliding the folder across before he even reached his chair. "I've been testing loads." He opened it and the pages startled him. Charts, equations, photographs of targets punched at ranges that stretched belief. She'd logged every variable: wind speed, angle, muzzle velocity, barometric shifts. Each entry was dated, precise, methodical. It wasn't just data, it was obsession disguised as order. "The standard rounds won't hold stability past 2800, she said. "So we've designed custom cartridges. Heavier projectiles, 400 grains. Modified propellant. We're pushing muzzle velocity to nearly 3,000 feet per second." Holt whistled under his breath. "That's experimental ordnance." "Yes, sir, but it works." He studied her face, calm, controlled, and yet he saw the shadow of tension in the set of her jaw. She was building a bullet for a shot that most considered impossible, and she knew it. "What did testing show?" he asked. "Accuracy within acceptable parameters at maximum range, but the environmental sensitivity is extreme. 2 degrees of temperature changes trajectory by 6 inches at 3,400 meters. A single mile-per-hour wind shift causes misses by feet." She said it flatly, like a surgeon describing risks to a patient who already knew the odds. Holt leaned back in his chair, rubbing the stubble along his jaw. "And yet you're still confident." Her green eyes lifted to his, steady. "I'm confident in my preparation. Not the world, not the weather, but myself. Yes, I can make the shot if the conditions hold." He nodded slowly, the weight of it pressing harder. It wasn't just about whether she could. It was whether she should. 2 days later, she boarded a flight to Nevada, proving ground stretched across desert so vast it swallowed sound. There, she tested the weapon modifications against distances few had ever attempted under controlled conditions. Holt followed her progress from reports. Each day the numbers returned. Hundreds of calculations, hundreds of adjustments. She'd fire, walk the range, measure drift, log data. Then fire again. The precision bordered on obsession, but Holt understood obsession was the only path to a bullet that would travel nearly 2 miles and still find its mark. When she returned weeks later, the desert dust still clinging to her boots, Holt called her in. "How'd it go?" She lowered herself into the chair across from him, setting her helmet on the floor. "Better than expected in some areas, worse in others." "Explain." She folded her hands, speaking with the same clinical tone as her reports. "The modified rounds achieve stability. Penetration remains lethal. At range, accuracy is within acceptable margins, but," she hesitated, "rare for her. The environmental tolerance is razor-thin. The atmosphere becomes the enemy. A half-degree shift in humidity. A gust too sudden to calculate. It's like threading a needle across 5 seconds of chaos." "5 seconds," Holt repeated. "Flight time," she confirmed. "From trigger to impact. In that span anything can change. The target's stride, the wind, even the earth beneath him warming just enough to push air upward." Holt let out a slow breath. He imagined those 5 seconds stretching across eternity. He imagined her lying prone, every muscle rigid, heart slowed, the world narrowing into silence, and then trusting physics to hold. "Are you certain you want to take this on?" he asked. Her answer came without hesitation. "I don't want to, I have to, no one else can." The room went quiet. Holt stared at her, 24 years old, carrying burdens most men twice her age couldn't imagine, and yet she shouldered them as though they were hers alone to carry. In the following weeks, preparations deepened. Operation Mountain Eagle. That was the name the brass assigned, as though a code name could soften the impossible. Spent hours in the armory with the ordnance specialists, adjusting powder charges to the grain, measuring seating depth of bullets, weighing brass casings until the numbers matched her exact tolerances. She checked and rechecked optics, making micro-adjustments until the scope aligned like an extension of her eye. Her life narrowed to decimals, to angles, to margins smaller than human error should allow. And still Holt noticed the isolation. She trained alone. She ate quickly, always at the edges of rooms. She lingered at maps long after others had gone. It wasn't distance for superiority. It was distance for survival. One night long after the base had quieted, Holt found her again in the armory. The lay across the table, stripped bare. She sat hunched over, studying the firing pin under magnification. "You ever sleep?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Enough. You've been at this for hours." "I'll be at it until it's right." She set the pin down gently, aligning it beside the others. At 3,400 meters, one imperfection means failure. He walked closer, resting his hand on the edge of the table. "And what about you? What about your imperfections?" For the first time she paused. Then she met his eyes, steady but carrying something deeper. "That's why I prepare, to keep them from deciding the outcome." Holt studied her, realizing what it cost to live this way, the relentless pursuit of control in a world where control was fragile. "Do you know the odds?" she asked quietly. "You told me." "No," her voice softened. "Not numbers, the real odds, the ones you can't measure, that a bird crosses the flight path, that a child appears in the wrong place at the wrong time, that after all the math, all the preparation, something human tilts the balance." He felt her words sink like stones. This was the part no chart could hold, the part soldiers carried in silence. Finally, she picked up the firing pin again, sliding it into the bolt with a click. "The bullet doesn't care, sir, but I do. That's the difference." Holt didn't answer. He just stood there, watching the way she worked, methodical and patient, bearing the weight of the impossible. In days, they would move to the field. In days, she would crawl onto a ridge with 3,400 meters of air between her and a man whose death could alter the course of the war. But tonight, in the silence of the armory, Holt saw her for what she was. Not a myth, not a legend in red ink, but a woman, young, precise, weary, determined, trying to hold her humanity against a storm that demanded she surrender it. And he wondered, not for the first time, how long she could keep fighting physics, the world and herself all at once. Why did the mountains always feel like they were listening? Moved in silence, boots pressing into dirt that had swallowed armies for centuries. The night swallowed her too, moonlight cutting jagged silver lines across as she climbed. Her pack weighed nearly 90 pounds, a rifle case, custom ammunition, weather station, optics. Yet she moved with deliberate steadiness, every step calculated, every sound measured against the shifting wind. Behind her, 2 spotters carried their own burdens, but even they let her lead. It wasn't rank that earned her point position. It was trust. They knew she saw things others didn't: terrain, angles, cover that looked like nothing until she made it something. By dawn, they had reached the outcrop. A scar of rock jutted above a valley where the compound lay in shadow, still miles away. Dropped to one knee, pulling out her rangefinder. She adjusted, eyes narrowing, then whispered, "3418, confirmed." Her voice was calm, almost eerily so, as she logged the number. 3,418 meters, beyond record, beyond doctrine, almost beyond belief. Holt's voice came through the earpiece. "Phantom 7, you're in position." "Affirmative, beginning observation." The mission plan gave her 72 hours to gather environmental data. 3 days on this ridge. 3 days watching a compound that never slept. 3 days of silence broken only by radio check-ins and the whisper of wind. She set up the micro-weather station, a small tripod bristling with sensors. It began logging wind speed, barometric pressure, temperature, humidity, all variables that could decide whether her bullet found its mark or vanished into nothing. For the first 12 hours, she barely moved. Spotters rotated, scanning sectors, but remained fixed behind her spotting scope, recording every pattern. Guard changes at 600, 1400, 2200. Civilians moving through the village at dusk. Children running barefoot between courtyards. Goats herded along the ridges. Each detail mattered. Each detail could shift the equation. By the second night, fatigue pressed heavy, but she wouldn't let it in. She drank water in measured sips, ate rations without looking away from the scope, slept in 90-minute cycles while the spotters kept watch. Even in rest, her hand never drifted far from the rifle. Holt monitored from the operations center, restless. He watched the data stream, her observations flowing like clockwork. Yet what concerned him wasn't the precision. It was the silence between her transmissions. She gave nothing away. No emotion. No hesitation. Just numbers, facts, patterns. But Holt knew silence could be dangerous. Silence could be where the ghosts lived. On the third day, weather shifted. Clouds dragged across the sky, wind pulling harder, erratic, adjusted, recalculated, logged. Her pencil scratched equations faster than most could follow. Still, the drift margin grew. At 1600 hours, she whispered into comms, "Conditions unfavorable. Stand by." Holt leaned forward. "Copy, Phantom 7. Do you assess abort?" "Negative. Temporary disturbance. Wind should stabilize within 2 hours." He hated how certain she sounded. Certain, but not careless. She wasn't guessing. She was trusting her hours of observation, her equations, her instinct. And yet instinct was what scared him most. Instinct wasn't math. Instinct was human. By the evening of the third day, the target arrived. Through her scope, watched him step into the courtyard, the man whose orders had killed 80 innocents. He was smaller than she imagined. Narrow-shouldered. Ordinary, even. He laughed as he spoke with his guards, hand gesturing casually as though nothing he'd done mattered. Adjusted her scope, logged wind, temperature, distance. She whispered to the spotter, "Hold final reading." "Wind 4.2, left to right," the spotter replied, voice low. She nodded, making the final correction. The reticle hovered 4 feet ahead of where the man stood. The bullet would take nearly 5 seconds. She was aiming at the future, not the present. And yet she hesitated. Through the scope, she saw a child dart across the courtyard, chasing a ball. Barefoot, laughing, oblivious. The child ran past the man, past the guards, disappearing into a doorway. But in that instant, the equation shifted from math to morality. Her finger tightened on the trigger, then released. Not yet. Not with ghosts still running in the open. Holt's voice crackled. "Phantom 7 status." "Stand by," she whispered, heart steady, voice flat. Minutes crawled. The man moved inside. Civilians bustled. Light shifted across the compound walls, and waited. Hours passed. She lay prone in the dust, cheek pressed to steel, body aching, eyes fixed through glass. The spotter shifted beside her, whispering updates. Wind steady, target re-emerging. And then the man returned. Alone this time, standing still, framed in the courtyard, the ball absent, the child gone. Exhaled slow, 1 breath, 2. The world narrowed again. Equations became instinct. Instinct became silence. Her finger brushed the trigger. And Holt, miles away, felt his chest tighten as if those 5 seconds would never end. Why did 5 seconds feel longer than 5 years? The courtyard lay framed in her scope, the target standing still at last, shadows stretching long across the compound. Cross exhaled, her cheek pressed to the rifle stock, her hands steady in a way that felt unnatural even to her. This wasn't calm. This was control wrestled from chaos. "Wind 4.1, steady left," the spotter whispered. "Confirmed," replied. Her voice was even, but inside her chest tightened. The distance mocked her. 3,418 meters. No shot had ever been confirmed at this range. It wasn't supposed to be possible. And yet here she was, breathing into the impossible. She pressed her finger against the trigger, barely moving it, just enough to feel the weight. 4 pounds of pressure. Any more and history would begin. In the command center, Holt leaned forward, headset tight against his ears. He could hear her breathing through the open channel. Slow, controlled, and beneath it, silence heavy enough to crush him. His mind ticked off the calculations. Drift, spin, drift, barometric pressure. She had rehearsed it thousands of times, but none of it mattered now. The numbers were set. The equation was complete. All that remained was the decision. Her finger closed. The rifle roared. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, rattling through her bones. Dust burst upward from the rock around her, and then came the silence, those long, eternal seconds when the bullet was still in the air. 1 second. She pictured the round cutting across distance, spinning faster than thought, tearing through wind. 2 seconds. She adjusted her focus, forcing her mind to stay still. 3 seconds. Her lungs burned. She hadn't taken another breath. 4 seconds. The man shifted, head turning as if some instinct warned him. 5 seconds. The bullet struck. Through her scope, saw the man jolt, arms flinching upward before he crumpled to the ground. The sound reached the compound late, confused echoes bouncing across the valley. Guards shouted. Civilians scattered, but the man didn't move again. She exhaled at last, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for far longer than 5 seconds. Her hands remained steady, but her eyes closed for just a heartbeat. Phantom 7, Holt's voice broke through, tight, urgent. Confirm impact. Her eyes opened again, back to the scope. The body lay still in the courtyard. The spotter whispered, confirmed, target neutralized. She pressed the transmit button. Overwatch 6, Phantom 7, confirmed kill, distance 3418 meters. The channel crackled back with cheers, disbelief, static-laced congratulations from voices that couldn't understand what it meant to be the one behind the trigger. To them, it was triumph. To her, it was silence. She dismantled the rifle slowly, methodically. Every piece cleaned, packed, secured. The spotters moved quickly, nervous about extraction, but kept her pace steady. She wouldn't let the weight of this shot live in haste. Hours later, back at base, Holt found her alone again in the armory. Same table, same fluorescent lights, same silence. The lei stripped bare, gleaming under her careful hands. He leaned against the doorway, studying her. You understand what you just did, right? That shot. He shook his head. It shouldn't even be possible. Her hands didn't stop moving. Possible is irrelevant. Necessary is what matters. He said softly, dropping formality for the first time. That was history. She looked up then, her green eyes sharp, unblinking. History doesn't feel any different than yesterday. Holt stepped closer, lowering himself into the chair opposite her. Most people will never even know your name. They'll never know who made that shot, and yet you'll carry it. Her cloth stilled. She set the bolt carrier down carefully, almost reverently, as though it were fragile glass. Then she spoke, her voice low. It isn't the distance that matters, sir. It's the time. 5 seconds. That's how long I had to wonder if I'd just taken the wrong life. If a child would step into the path. If a gust of wind would turn precision into tragedy. Her words sank into the silence. Holt felt them like stones in his chest. You didn't miss, he said gently. She gave the faintest nod. This time. The weight of those two words lingered. This time. That night she didn't go to the mess hall. Didn't join the others who toasted the operation, who laughed too loud to cover their nerves. Instead, she stayed in the armory, wiping steel with cloth, chasing a cleanliness that would never erase what lingered in her mind. Holt stopped by hours later. The room smelled of solvent and oil. She sat hunched over still, her movements slower now, fatigue pressing against her like gravity. You're not sleeping, he said. Neither are you, she replied without looking up. He sat down beside her, close enough that he could see the tremor in her fingers when she thought no one was watching. Do you regret it? He asked finally. She paused. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she set the rifle aside and looked straight at him. Her eyes were tired, older. I regret that it had to happen, that this is the world we live in. But do I regret taking the shot? No, because if I hadn't, more would be dead tomorrow. Her honesty was a knife, sharp, cutting through any illusions he might have wanted to hold. And Holt realized something then. The shot wasn't hers alone. The weight belonged to all of them, but she was the one who bore it most directly. the one who lived with it in silence. He reached for the file on the table, flipping it open. Another line of red ink now marked the page. Confirmed engagement, 3,418 meters. Operation Mountain Eagle. He stared at it, then back at her. You know this will follow you forever. Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile, or might have just been exhaustion. It already does. She picked up the cloth again, pressing it to steel, movement steady despite the storm inside. Holt watched her, feeling the truth settle heavy in his chest. Because for Cross, history wasn't a headline, it wasn't glory, it wasn't triumph. It was silence. Why was the armory always empty when she needed it most? Sat alone again, across the table like an old companion she wasn't sure she wanted. Weeks had passed since the shot, the one no one believed possible, the one that traveled almost 2 miles to find its mark. The base had returned to routine. Missions rotated, convoys rolled, operations stacked one after another. But for her, silence lingered. The file now carried its third line in red ink. Confirmed engagement, 3,418 meters. Operation Mountain Eagle. Her name would never appear beside it in the news. The world would never know. And maybe that was for the best, because what they celebrated as impossible, she carried as unbearable. She ran the cloth across the barrel again, though the metal already gleamed. It wasn't cleaning anymore. It was ritual, a way to quiet the noise no one else could hear. Holt stepped into the room, his presence softer now than it had once been. He didn't speak at first, just stood in the doorway, watching her work. He'd learned she didn't need company filled with words. Sometimes she only needed someone willing to share the silence. Finally, he crossed the room, setting a folder on the table. She didn't look at it. New orders, he said. Different theater, different terrain. They want you to rotate forward. She didn't stop moving the cloth. They always want something. He sat across from her, studying the way her hands never faltered. You don't have to take it. You could request reassignment. You've done more than enough. Her eyes lifted, sharp but tired. And who takes the next shot if I do? Who carries it then? He wanted to answer, wanted to tell her that someone else could, that the burden didn't always have to be hers. But the truth stuck in his throat, because deep down he knew there weren't many like her. Instead, he asked, and what about you? How long can you keep carrying this before it breaks you? Her gaze lingered on the rifle. The silence stretched long enough to make him ache. Then she spoke, barely above a whisper. It already has, but breaking isn't the same as quitting. Holt leaned back, the weight of her words pressing hard. She wasn't wrong. Soldiers broke in different ways. Some shattered loud, others quietly. She was the quiet kind, fractured inside but still holding herself together because stopping wasn't an option. He reached for the file on the table. The red ink glared at him. Kandahar Ridge. Operation Desert Strike. Operation Mountain Eagle. Each line a story the world would never hear. They'll make myths out of you, he said softly. Legends. Numbers passed around briefing rooms. Ghost stories for recruits. Her lips curved faintly, almost bitter. But not a name, not a person. He nodded, and that's the tragedy. She returned to the rifle, hands steady again. Or maybe it's the point. Maybe people aren't supposed to know. Maybe the world doesn't need to see who pulls the trigger, only that someone does. The words hung heavy. Holt realized then that she wasn't seeking recognition. She wasn't even seeking understanding. What she wanted, what she needed was meaning. And meaning didn't come from headlines. It came from the quiet knowledge that lives had been spared, even if the cost was hers to bear. Later that night, the base buzzed with celebration. Another operation completed. Another convoy returned safe. Didn't join them. She sat on the ridge outside the wire, knees pulled close, staring at the desert stars. Holt found her there, the night cool, silence broken only by distant generators. He sat beside her without a word. For a long time, they just watched the sky. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever think about the people, the ones we don't see?" He glanced at her every day. She nodded, her eyes fixed upward. I wonder about their lives, their families, what they believed in, whether they deserved the path that ended at my crosshairs. I wonder if one day, when I'm old, I'll still hear their names even though I never knew them. Her voice cracked slightly, the first time he'd ever heard it. And Holt understood then that beneath all the precision, beneath all the control, she was still human. And being human was the hardest part. He wanted to tell her it was okay, that she'd done enough. But he knew words weren't what she needed. What she needed was someone who wouldn't flinch at her silence. The stars stretched endless above them. For the first time in years, Holt felt small in a way that wasn't fear. And maybe that was the lesson. They weren't giants, even when they did impossible things. They were just people trying to hold dignity in a world that demanded violence. When she rose to leave, Holt stayed seated, watching her silhouette fade back toward the base. Rifle slung across her shoulder, stride steady, head held high. He realized then she would keep going, not because she wanted to, not because it was glory, but because the world demanded it and she refused to let silence fall empty. The next morning her gear was already packed, new orders in hand, another mission waiting. She didn't say goodbye, she never did. Holt watched her board the helicopter, her figure framed against the rising sun. For a moment she turned, eyes scanning the base one last time. Their gaze met, brief, wordless enough. And then she was gone, swallowed by the thunder of rotors, the dust rising like smoke around her. He stood there long after the helicopter disappeared. And he thought about her file, about the lines of red ink that told only numbers, not stories. He thought about the silence that followed her everywhere. And he realized something he would carry with him long after she was gone. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.